Good morning, everyone. It's Sean from Pulse Markets here this morning. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for attending. I'd also like to thank Lee Creek for coming in today to give us shareholders an update and a chance to ask some questions as to how things are going. As always, I'm just going to do some housekeeping. This is not financial advice. This is merely to make everyone aware of what's happening with Lee Creek. If you'd like further information, please feel free to contact me at a later date. But firstly, I'd like to welcome Justin Peters and the Chairman of Lee Creek Energy, and thank you for coming.
Thanks, Sean. Good to be here, and hello to everybody.
Great. Justin, as we've discussed, the format for today will be you giving a quick update of the important things that are happening at Lee Creek. There's been a couple of things out in the market recently which people may not have seen. There was a podcast you did with, I think, a Farmers Association, which I listened to on Monday morning, which is very, very interesting. If anyone wants that podcast, please feel free to ask. It's very intriguing. It's quite good. You've also made an announcement this morning, Justin, that DLM is progressing, which congratulations on that. That's a massive milestone. That's really good to see, and I'm sure people want to hear all about that. So what I'd like to do is to hand over to you because people are here to talk to you. And if you could just give us an update, Justin, I really appreciate it. So thank you very much for coming.
Okay, thanks, guys. Thanks, Sean. And we've got Tony on the line as well. A few of you know Tony, but he won't be saying much, I don't think, at this time, but I'm sure he will afterwards. Look, the structure of this is going to be pretty straightforward. When Sean came to me and asked me to have a look at this, whether I'd do it, I said to him I wanted the ability to be able to answer lots of questions. It was really important that we could actually have a decent Q&A session within here rather than me just sprout off of some PowerPoint slides. So the worst thing you can do is end up with a presentation that's, death by PowerPoint. We've got a heap of questions that have come in, so I want to give some time to them. My understanding too is that we can also deal with questions that are coming in during the next hour as well. So I'll get moving on it and get started on the presentation, then we can go into the questions as well. Only one of the things I have to say is that I noticed, okay, so the prezzo's up. Page 2 of the presentation was the disclaimer form. We're a listed company. As a result of that, any information I give you today is general in nature. And the simple one is don't buy or sell shares based on anything I say today. Make your own minds up on what you hear and what you want to do yourself. It's just going to be a very quick presentation. There's around about 18 or 19 slides. I'm intending only to go through sort of the first 7 or 8 and then move across to the questions. And you can access the rest of it through Sean if you want to get the copy of the presentation. And also I'll refer to some of the slides later on when I'm starting to answer questions as well. So let's get started on the slide 3. Overview of the project. Most of you are well aware of who we are and what we're doing. We're about 550 k's north of Adelaide. We're at the old Electricity Trust of South Australia, and then it was Alinta's coal mine sitting up there at Lee Creek. We've been involved in this, some of us have been involved in this project now for nearly 10 years. And we started out as a UCG company, or an ISG, it's called in South Australia. And we had a look at the fact that we make syngas. And from that process, we've moved over the last few years, what's the best return we can get on our money? And it became very, very clear to us for several reasons that urea was going to be the path to go. And that was basically because we could make urea from syngas at a very, very, very cheap price compared to the rest of the market. But from a narrative point of view, it's extremely important that we weren't going to be sitting there competing against renewable energy and power generation. We weren't going to be subject to the vagaries of the actual market, and that we didn't want to go down that path. We had another option there where we could actually swing the gas across to pipeline gas methane, of which we could get about 80% of our synthetic gas or syngas converted across to methane and pipeline gas, put it into the pipeline. That we looked at very carefully, and interesting, I'll refer to it a bit later on. Early on, we were actually given an offtake agreement by one of the largest companies in Australia for all of our gas. And for reasons which will become clear a bit later on, we declined that and kept working through the pre-feasibility study and the demonstration phase to work out what was going to be best for us. You've seen the third dot point, zero carbon by 2030. We think we're going to be zero carbon by 2023, let alone 2030. This is a genuine statement. This is not greenwashing, and we'll explain why we can get to that in one of the slides. The urea market is pretty clear, and there's some slides further on that deal with this, but nearly all of our urea is imported either a little from China, and the most of it comes in from the Middle East because of the gas prices. It is not competitive at the moment to make urea in Australia if you're buying your gas. And this is one of the great advantages we had, was that with syngas, you already have the gas streams that you need to produce ammonia and then urea. And that is, you have nitrogen, hydrogen, CO2, and you have your methane within that gas stream. It's very easy for us to split those gases up at the wellhead, as opposed to our competitors who have to get natural gas and then split that gas into those different gas streams we were talking about. And of course, they have to buy that gas at market prices. And anyone will know at the moment that market prices are looking at between $8 and $10 a gigajoule, and spot market last week hit $20 a gig. We're sitting there at $1 for our gas, and they just cannot compete with that. So as I said, it became clear that's where we go. We also were well aware of the fact that if we couldn't have a resolution or a solution for CO2, we were going to have some major roadblocks in the way. We looked at the fact that from a narrative point of view, it was going to be great for us to be saying that we, one, produce this in Australia, two, that we actually stop the reliance on imports of fertiliser into Australia. And anyone who read the Fin Review in the last couple of days would have noticed that China, the National Reform Development Commission in China, has actually banned the export of fertilisers out of China because they're concentrating on keeping that product within their domestic market. And it just highlights the dangers you have when a farming industry relies on importing from overseas, whether it be China or the Middle East. The other thing we looked at when we looked at Lee Creek was the infrastructure that was there. And that is that anyone who's been there, anyone who's seen it, it's an open cut coal mine. It's been in operation for about 60 years. It has a train line that actually goes into the site, which means that if we're exporting urea, we can use that train line easily. It has a highway that goes up to Lee Creek, has an airport there, and it has infrastructure with the township at Lee Creek, which is only about 15 k's south of the actual mine site itself. So the infrastructure was in place. The legislation in South Australia was very pro-UCG, and that's been proven out by the fact that we've gone through a whole range of processes, and I'll go through them in a minute. And when we had a look at this particular slide, this relates to some of the questions that have been asked a bit later, and I'll go through them in a bit more detail. But when we first started, when we took over Marathon back in 2015, and we sat in front of the fund managers around Australia and the institutions and the analysts, now these were the sorts of things we were told we would not be able to achieve. And we were told these even as recently as 2 or 3 months ago, when we'd already achieved them. And it was quite interesting to see that these were the sorts of things that were thrown at us. But I'll go through them because the list is actually incredibly important. The first was we would not be able to list because we're doing UCG. That was probably the easiest thing. By the way, there was no obstacle there from the ASX or from ASIC, so that wasn't really a problem, but we were told that. We'd not get approval from the SA government to get the petroleum exploration licence, which was wrong. We got it. It has always been my view, if you talk about risk and you talk about the major obstacles to success, the major obstacles to success for us were going to be the licensing process. And that was largely because anyone who knows what happened in Queensland with the UCG industry in Queensland, if you look at the companies up there, they all ran into headwinds with the government. I think they'll play out in the next 12 to 24 months, and you'll see the truth in what did happen. But regardless of that, that was always going to be one of our biggest issues, and that was getting our approvals. So we did. We got our PEL, our petroleum exploration licence, was not a problem from the South Australian government. We were told that we'd have trouble with the traditional owners, and we have had problems with them. But equally, we signed a cultural heritage agreement with them that allowed us to go on site, providing that we complied with that cultural heritage agreement, which we have done. Right, we're told we wouldn't be able to raise money for the commercial demonstration field. We did. Right, we actually raised the money for that. We've had no problems raising money. It hasn't been an easy task at times, and I wouldn't want to be out there trying to raise money today when you look at what COVID is doing from a lockdown point of view in Sydney, Brisbane now, and Melbourne. South Australia was in lockdown for a week, but thankfully we're out of that. We're told we didn't have the technical ability to be able to deliver. We couldn't do it. We made a very, very clear decision at the start of this process, because of the problems with Link in Queensland, that it was advisable and wise for us to look at the CSIRO teams that were working at Carbon Energy, and that's who we actually employed at the start of this process when we did that technology transfer into our company. We were told when the Environmental Defender's Office took us to court and tried to injunct us from doing the demonstration facility, that we wouldn't get that through and we would not succeed in court. And they were wrong again. We did succeed in court. The injunction was thrown out and we went ahead with the plant. We were told we wouldn't flare gas at the site, and we did flare gas at the site. We were told we wouldn't produce gas at commercial volumes. If we couldn't produce gas at commercial volumes, we could not get our PRMS. We could not get our 2P reserve. If we didn't do that, we couldn't go to the next stage where we got our petroleum license. We produced commercial gas, and we showed, and it was important when we went to ThyssenKrupp, and it was extremely important when we dealt with Dalium, that they knew that we could produce the gas and saw the logs of everything we produced. We were told we wouldn't get a PRMS. We had a JORC, obviously because of the coal that was there, but because we're in the gas industry, we needed that PRMS, and we got a PRMS. Once again, they were wrong, and the PRMS was 1,153 PJ. The number will always stand in my mind because it's 3 PJ more than BHP had. We were told that we wouldn't get a petroleum production license, and this was the big one, right? And that was that we had to move from an exploration license to a production license. But as you all know, we got that petroleum production license. We were told that we couldn't get an EPC contract with funding. Anyone can get an EPC contract, right? All you're doing is getting your engineering, procurement, and construction contract. You're paying somebody. So that's not difficult to actually get one. To get one with a funding component attached to it was extremely difficult, and we did it with DLM. That's just a list of some of the major achievements. Behind them is a huge amount of work that's taken place to get us there. We have achieved every single thing on that page and more. And every single thing on that page, we were told by fundies and instos we would not be able to achieve. Okay, so the manufacturing process, and some of the questions a bit later deal with this one as well, but it's pretty straightforward. And that is at the front end, we produce the gas. So at Lee Creek, we'll produce that synthetic gas. There are the gas streams in there. There's also a component of CH4 methane within that group as well. But it becomes very obvious when you look at this, that if you're feeding hydrogen and nitrogen into an ammonia plant, we've already got that gas stream at the front. The only issue is, of course, when you go down this path, it's capital intensive. The other thing too that hasn't been spoken about much is that we could actually stop at the ammonia synthesis level and just export ammonia. We don't have to go to that urea production phase. However, from a financial point of view, and certainly from a narrative point of view, that was definitely the way for us to go. So once you have your ammonia, then you're simply adding your CO2 into that process at the urea facility, and you're producing urea. It's a granular urea. Each one of these processes, I might add, other than your gas processing at the front end for the ISG or UCG, is straight off the shelf. It's relevant when people ask questions, has Dalium got experience in this area? And I'll go to this slide in a while. But if you have a look at it, you can buy an ammonia plant straight off the shelf. There's nothing unusual about them. There's no technical risk whatsoever in that. You can buy a urea facility straight off the shelf. You have to pay licensing, and there's a high capex involved in these two, but they are not difficult processes. So the only technological risk in this process is at the front end producing the gas, and then having a partner who can deliver on building the ammonia and the urea facility. Activities today, environmental credentials have become very clear and very, very important. As I said before, we can't just make this statement if we don't believe we can get there. And we have a slide which shows you how we will get there to actually having a zero footprint. However, we got the petroleum licence from the South Australian government. We have to show everybody that we can get to a zero carbon, and it's interesting. If you look at the penalties that are going to be applied to people with a carbon footprint, they range from $10 a tonne to $80 a tonne. I can tell you as soon as it starts going over about $25 a tonne, a lot of your emitters in Australia will not have a business unless they find some way to lower their carbon footprint. We're a signatory to the United Nations Global Compact. It looks like, for a lot of people, it looks like fluff. You know, you're marketing, you're putting your name to it, and it's fluff. It's not fluff. Let me tell you, it's part of the ESG process, And if we talk to the fund managers, we talk to the big funds, particularly in Europe and in the US, ESG is incredibly important. And being part of this global compact requires us to prove up each year to be a member of that. If we look at the syngas development, we've done the PCD, Pre Commercial phase has been completed. We've had our PRMS. We've got our production licence, which is awarded by the government. We do not need another licence from the South Australian government. We have a storage licence, we have a retention licence for other leases, and we have a petroleum licence for this lease. And we expect to go to 2 different FIDs. The first one was stage 1, that has already been achieved by Lee Creek with the board, which approved going ahead on stage 1. But there will be an FID process as well for stage 2. And that's the work we're doing on the BFS and the feed with DLM. The Urea production facility, full-scale PFS was done with ThyssenKrupp, came up with an NPV of 3.4 billion. That was based on a couple of things. Obviously, everyone will know that these sorts of numbers come up through the inputs, and how robust and strong those inputs are very important in coming up with a decent set of numbers. You can't fudge it. You can fudge it on a pre-fees, you can fudge it internally, but as soon as you go out to parties like DLM or Sinochem or Sinopec, you can't fudge those numbers. They go through those numbers. And what was really interesting is that Sinochem did their evaluation on us as well, independently of ThyssenKrupp, and came in with a few dollars difference in the total price. So that was reassuring to us, but it was also reassuring to some of our partners that 2 different parties independently had done this work and came up with the same set of numbers. Excuse me. We have an EPC CF contract with Korean construction giant DLM. DLM are huge, and I'll go into that slide in a minute just to show what they do and how big they are. But within that was an important part, and the F is the funding component. And that was that DLM were comfortable in meeting with their banks and coming up with that comfort letter, which we have from their bank, saying that once FID is approved, then they will go ahead and fund up to 1.5 billion of the project. Immediately, you come out with that. People say, oh, well, it's not that secure, it's not that strong. Until you get FID, you cannot sit down and negotiate a binding agreement with a bank. So we have to get to FID before we progress to the next stage. But let me assure you, we spoke to this bank, we spoke with DLM regularly over this issue. And this bank would not go to writing if they weren't confident in both their relationship with DLM and our project. When I said we're going to be carbon neutral, it's a pretty easy process for us. And that is, you think about it, 0.73 tonnes of CO2 are used per tonne of urea. So a large amount of our CO2 that's produced in the gasification process is actually stripped out, and then it is used right within the actual process itself. But there will be surplus, and we're lucky. And in a previous podcast I explained the advantages that Lee Creek have in the CCS process. And very quickly, because it's important, but I do want to touch on this, is that the reason that CCS has not been overly successful around Australia in the past, and a lot of money has been spent on it. Coal 21 spent money on this. The federal government gave lots of grants on CCS, and there was a very simple reason it wasn't working. Most of the projects were post-stack stripping, and that is that if you put your coal or you put your gas into a power plant, your CO2 comes out of the stack. That is incredibly hard to capture because you have high volume, high velocity gases, and you have a whole range of gases within that, not just CO2. So a lot of those projects had the disadvantage of having to capture it first. Secondly, they then had to find somewhere to do CCS. And it wasn't in the same location, I can assure you. There are not too many sinks that are available easily for CCS. In America, they've used old oil fields, and they've pumped the CCS at depth down into those oil fields for enhanced oil recovery. But you can't just pump it down underground. You have to have a receptor. You have to have either a rock structure or a salt structure that can absorb that CO2 and keep it underground, not let it leak back to the surface. So they had to find somewhere to do it, and that was not easy. And then the third problem they had was they had to transport that CO2 to that location. So you had to compress your CO2, either build a pipeline or you had to truck it. All right. expensive process. So you had to find a location, you had to post capture, and you had to transport it. We don't have to do any of those things. We can strip the CO2 out at the wellhead. It's an easy process. There are plenty of membrane processes out there that allow you to strip it out. We then compress it at site, and we can use the spent gasifiers to store the CO2. And the beauty of that is that we actually have the pipes already in place. We already have the compressors there. We already have the wells down into those areas. So we don't even have to build on what we already have to be able to do it at CCS. So we feel we have a strategic advantage in CCS that no one else has. So we can go along that path with the surplus CO2, but there are other options there with offsets and carbon farming, which I don't really want to go into at this time because I do want to get to questions in a minute. I'll be very brief on this. This one you would have seen plenty of times. We put this in our previous announcements. One of the things we are doing is moving away from a marketing point of view and a strategic point of view of pushing the gas that we have because we're in a market with lots of other players, but we have 1,153 PJ. And I'll actually explain that a little bit more about the marketing strategy in some of the questions that have come up too. There are quite a few other slides in the pack, which I'm sure you can have access to, but I want to go to the questions now because we do have a lot of questions and I want to be able to go through them. So I think the process for this, Sean, is that you're going to ask the questions.
That's correct.
Okay.
Thank you for that, Justin. That was great.